Welcome to Buttonwoods Museum. For those of you who don't know me, I am Antoine. I'm the educator here. Today we're going to be looking at part 2 of a 2-part series that I'm doing about the American Revolution. So last month in April, part 1 looked at the economic prelude to the American Revolution. So basically the socio-economic conditions preluding the revolution, leading up to causing it, etc. But today, we're going to be taking a closer look at the actual outbreak of the War for Independence itself, and with a careful eye on the effect that patriotic narratives of liberty, unity, freedom, all those concepts, the effect that they had upon the conflict back then in its day, and also the effect that they have had on our modern remembrance of the events of the revolution. So there are a lot of commonly held beliefs about how exactly our colonial predecessors managed to win independence from what was undoubtedly the greatest military power of their era. So I'm looking forward to unpacking some factors that maybe are less widely discussed than some of the most well-known facts. And with that being said, we can jump into a quick recap of some of the major ideas we discussed in part 1, just for those of you who weren't here. So, those who were here will remember how our story mostly began with the French and Indian War, and that's in the mid-1700s. So that was a war in which Britain was protecting their interests in the American colonies from their biggest rival, the French. And many colonists both contributed to and profited from the war effort. So they felt a degree of discontentment once the British Empire imposed greater economic regulations on the colonies to curtail some practices that had arisen due to economic hardship, like smuggling, and that made it difficult for the crown to recoup its wartime debts. Many economic regulations, like taxes, had been present in the New World since its founding, and colonial charters essentially established the colonies as almost like a franchise under control of the British Crown. So in accordance, and this is in accordance with the mercantilist economic system. Mercantilism is a really simple concept. It was the prevailing economic theory of the day. So it just is limited to these 3 points here, that wealth exists in limited natural resources. Thus, establishing colonies increases a state's global access to those resources. And of course, resources being things like lumber, iron ore, precious metals, gold, silver, and all that. And therefore, 3, regulating trade prevents a loss of wealth to competing world powers. So taxes in place or tariffs to prevent trading with foreign powers allowed Britain to maintain as much of that wealth within the British Empire as they could. That was the prevailing economic theory of the day. So, thus, colonial British citizens under the mercantilist economic system were not constitutionally granted parliamentary representation on matters of taxation. So, mass protests would then eventually break out in the mid-1760s over these acts, like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, etc. I'm sure we've all heard a lot about these. But one thing we talked about last time was generally when colonial appeals to Parliament were legally proven, were able to legally prove that the taxes were unconstitutional, they were generally revoked. In other cases, mass protests would result in greatly escalated outcomes, including assaults on royal officials, attacks on trade vessels, and even bloodshed, like that seen at the tragic Boston Massacre of 1770. Even organized resistance promoted by groups like the Sons of Liberty would lead to heavy consequences like those resulting from the Boston Tea Party of 1773, and that is where we're going to pick the story back up here. So, as I'm sure you can well recall, on the night of December 16th, 1773, several assemblies of men, led by Samuel Adams of the Boston chapter of the Sons of Liberty, boarded 3 East India Company ships and threw a total of 342 chests of tea overboard into Boston Harbor, which was valued at 9,659 pounds sterling of tea, equivalent to almost $2 million in property damage today. This was, of course, an act of protest against the Tea Act, which was legislation that was passed by Parliament specifically to counteract the smuggling of foreign tea. And this was in an attempt to save the East India Company from bankruptcy. The process by which tea was sold in the colonies basically meant that on its way from China and India, tea had to first go to Britain, where it was sold at an English tea auction and was taxed there as an import, and then it was only then taken to the colonies and sold and taxed again. So there was a huge rise in price just due to the span of travel that tea was coming from. And so nobody in the colonies wanted to buy British tea, it was just too expensive. They preferred to buy tea that was more freely available from Dutch markets or French markets or Spanish markets at a cheaper cost. And so the Tea Act was put in place actually to reduce those taxes on British tea and thus try to encourage colonists to buy it. It had the effect of creating a monopoly for the East India Company in an attempt to kind of save it from bankruptcy. That was, the East India Company was Britain's biggest economic powerhouse of a company. And if it was to have gone bankrupt, it would have been a huge economic impact on the entire world because the British East India Company was involved in many economies, many markets. So that was sort of the purpose of the Tea Act. To say the least, when the Boston Tea Party then occurred, there was quite a buzz in the aftermath. And Samuel Adams quickly took to the press and sent letters to many of his fellow colonists to defend the Tea Party, while Paul Revere journeyed between the northeastern colonies to spread the word about it. It almost goes without saying that British officials were furious at the property destruction, and when the news finally crossed the Atlantic the following month, even though many colonists remained supportive, some even going as far as to take boats out into Boston Harbor in the days that followed and using the oars to resubmerge any chests of tea that floated back to the surface. It's less obvious in our sort of common remembrance that public opinion was actually divided on the Boston Tea Party quite a bit. Not just between Britain and the colonies, but also amongst colonists themselves. In fact, when Paul Revere brought the news to the New York Committee of Correspondence, a collection, which was a collection of merchants in the mid-Atlantic states, they soon sent a letter offering full recompensation to Parliament for the loss of the tea. And that was their hope to kind of spare the rest of the colonies from the wrath of collective punishment. Sorry about that. So yes, there was a lot of division. Other prominent sympathizers decried the protest more directly, and you might be surprised to learn that Benjamin Franklin actually was rather opposed to the Boston Tea Party and made this expressly clear in a letter to Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And he recounted saying, "I'm truly concerned, as I believe all considerate men are with you, that there should seem to be a necessity for carrying matters to such extremity as, in a dispute about public rights, to destroy private property. Thus, notwithstanding the blame justly due to those who obstructed the return of the tea, it is impossible to justify with people so prejudiced in favor of the power of Parliament to tax America, as most are in this country. As the East India Company, however, are not our adversaries, and the offensive measure of sending their teas did not take its rise with them, but was an exponent of the ministry to serve them and yet avoid a repeal of the old act. I cannot wish and hope that before any compulsive measures are thought of here, our general court will have shown a disposition to repair the damage and make compensation to the company. So in essence, Franklin's response, it can be a little bit dense to unpack, but it's pretty clear and present that he totally disapproved of vandalism chiefly, and had strong encouragement for the damages to be repaid. He does still make a few other fair assessments, pointing out that if the colonies are dealing with a British Parliament that already perceives the colonies to be under their regulation by default, then acting so unruly may only further justify their tightening grip. Because as Franklin puts it, it is Parliament who the struggle is against, right? It's not the East India Company. So if the Tea Act was put in place to counteract the East India Company's bankruptcy, then by destroying the entirety of their means of income in the colonies, that only really gives Parliament greater reason to continue making legislation on the East India Company's behalf. His point is that it doesn't really serve the colonies very well to sort of intermix economic issues with political issues, and rather unfortunately for the colonies, Ben Franklin's predictions would be proven correct in the spring of 1774, when Parliament responded to the defiance of Massachusetts with the passing of the Coercive Acts, which you may have instead heard referred to as the Intolerable Acts, as they were known in the 13 colonies. So these are similar to the Townshend Acts in that they are a collection of a few different laws, not any one single law passed by Parliament, but unlike the Townshend Acts, these acts, the Coercive Acts, had very little to do with economics. It's pretty clear that they were almost entirely legislated with the nearly sole intent of punishing Massachusetts specifically for its civil disobedience. And the first of these countermeasures would be the Boston Port Act. What that did was order the blockading of the Port of Boston against all trade. So that's not just foreign trade, British trade as well. That means Boston was to get no incoming or have no outgoing trade with anybody until the East India Company's losses were repaid in full. As unexpected as such drastic measures may have been for the people of Massachusetts, perhaps unjustly unexpected, the Boston Port Act would also have some unforeseen outcomes for the British Empire as well. Primarily in the massive relief effort that they did not expect to be organized by the other colonies to help mitigate the shortages Boston would inevitably suffer from the blockade. Over 6,000 pounds sterling worth of supplies were sent to Massachusetts from places like Pennsylvania and North Carolina. And that was very telling, because if you remember, the destruction of the tea was worth about 9,000 pounds sterling. And rather than sending that money to relieve the blockade and pay back the losses, the colonies said, we're going to send about 2/3 of the amount to Boston just to help them, right? So it was sending a pretty strong message that we can afford to pay back much of these damages, and we're not going to. Was basically the idea. Furthermore, Parliament's willing apparentness to starve out an entire colony for the actions of only a small part of its population sort of overplayed their hand and really soured the public opinion of Parliament in the eyes of many other colonists from outside of Massachusetts. The British Empire made it abundantly clear they were capable of resorting to collective punishment. And this is even while other colonies like New York had initially put on airs of loyalty and offering to make repayment. So this effect, however, was also somewhat twofold. In addition to the sympathy that we've established thus far, the Port Act also contributed to the radicalization of many colonists who may have otherwise been uninvolved in any sort of politics beforehand. So, I'd like to draw an example to a man named David Ramsey, who was a South Carolinian who began his career as a physician, but he was actually spurred into politics by the Coercive Acts, and he wasn't from Massachusetts at all. He actually went on to serve as a field surgeon during the War for Independence, and eventually earned a seat on the South Carolina Senate. Reflecting on the Boston Port Act later in 1789, when he wrote History of the American Revolution, he said, "The other provinces were but remotely affected by the fate of Massachusetts. They were happy and had no cause on their own account to oppose the government of Great Britain. In the counties and towns of the several provinces, as well as in the cities, the people assembled and passed resolutions expressive of their rights and of the detestation of the late American acts of Parliament. These had an instantaneous effect on the minds of thousands. Not only the young and impetuous, but the aged and temperate joined in pronouncing them to be unconstitutional and oppressive." So, as Ramsey rather clearly describes, many colonists who, like him, who otherwise were really not interested in politics or criticizing the British government before the Coercive Acts, were suddenly given a reason to by Parliament's very harsh treatment of Boston. But radicalization, as it is, often goes both ways, right? So, on the flip side, I'll draw attention to a bit of a foil to Dr. Ramsey with another physician, Sylvester Gardner, who was a Massachusetts colonist who made his living as a pharmaceutical merchant. After the actions of patriots like the Sons of Liberty incurred the wrath of the Coercive Acts, Gardner signed his name on a petition to the royal governor of Massachusetts and incidentally incurred the wrath of Boston upon himself in return. So he was expressing his disapproval sort of similarly to Benjamin Franklin in signing a petition of apology on behalf of Massachusetts, and reflected that later, "I found I could not stay in Boston and trust my person with a set of lawless rebels whose actions have disgraced human nature, and who have treated all the king's loyal subjects that have fallen into their hands with great cruelty, and for no other crime than for their loyalty to the best of kings and a peaceable submission to the best constituted government on earth. I don't believe there ever was a people in any age or part of the world that enjoyed so much liberty as the people of America did under the mild indulgent government of England. And never was a people under a worse state of tyranny than they are at present." So, from the perspective of a man of Gardner's disposition, simple compliance with the law is what put him under threat from patriots who were seeking to break the law, and who in their very cause for the defiance of tyranny actually invited even greater tyranny upon themselves and all of their fellow colonists. And so I think these two men, who are of very similar backgrounds, they're both physicians, they're both of the upper class, they show us how easily two very similar people can be radicalized in two completely different directions. So this is the sort of dual effect that Parliament's initial response to Massachusetts would have on a lot of people, right? Not just these two, obviously. And that is what we will continue to see in our next Coercive Act, which is the Massachusetts Government Act. That revoked Massachusetts Bay's colonial charter. It forbade unpermitted town meetings, and it required all governing officials to be directly appointed by the royal governor, Parliament, or the king himself. So those of you who might remember back to part 1 of the program might remember that I made a comparison between the practice of colonization and our modern practice of franchising. They're sort of similar. A colony fundamentally is something that was once a private enterprise started by a wealthy person able to settle land and bring settlers with them. And it's sort of like a company. In fact, they use the word company in all of the colonial charters. And the thing that makes it similar to a franchise is like the franchise trademark. Think of it as the British flag, right? So it's in exchange for conducting trade and sort of spreading British citizenry around the world, you're guaranteed protection by the Royal Navy, and you're guaranteed certain rights under the British Constitution. So that being said, the Massachusetts Government Act revoking the colonial charter is sort of equivalent to like a massive corporate takeover of a single franchise location, right? And that's by like the highest level of upper management possible, the king. This would also come to backfire on the British Empire, however, as the total dissolution of Massachusetts' colonial charter served to stir widespread mistrust even further in the British Empire throughout the other colonies. From the other colonies' perspective, they began to fear that if Parliament was able to easily void the most fundamental contract between a colony and their empire by simply passing a more recent law, then that means there's really nothing legally protecting the other colonies from Parliament doing the same to them. And yet, that very threat of parliamentary tyranny also has the dual effect of invalidating Parliament's authority in the eyes of many colonists. The conclusion is basically that if the British Empire is so willing to overturn the most fundamental agreement with the colonies, then Parliament itself has therefore proven its word to be contractually meaningless. It's sort of like the boy who cried wolf effect, if you will. And Massachusetts itself was a really great embodiment of this idea. Massachusetts responded to the Government Act by forming the Massachusetts Provincial Government, which was essentially an alternative colonial government that continued operating just underneath and sort of outside the realm of British authority in all of the regions outside of Boston, because of course Boston was blockaded and locked down by the British Empire. But outside of Boston, people just decided to continue business as usual. They had all of the infrastructure and officials in place already, so they just kind of said, well, we'll just keep running the government without that British trademark, basically. And this was fundamentally founded on the notion that a broken charter contract rendered the British Empire's authority here null and void. If they're breaking their contract, then they have sort of forfeited their rights to this colony. And they were essentially right, because the Massachusetts provincial government would maintain control of most of the colony until the establishment of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1790. So even though the British occupied Boston, they really weren't able to do anything about folks just outside of Boston continuing to govern themselves. The implications of our next intolerable act, however, would be too concerning for colonists to simply ignore and carry on business as usual, and that would be the Administration of Justice Act, which granted the royal governor of Massachusetts the authority to dismiss charges pressed against royal officials by colonial citizens if they were considered to be levied without fair legal cause, and would also allow for a retrial to be held in a different legal district than the suit was pressed if it was considered that the local jury would be too biased against the crown. The Justice Act would cause a stir far beyond Massachusetts, and many colonists throughout the 13 colonies began referring to it as the Murder Act, for the implication that royal officials would be able to be pardoned of any crime, up to and including murder. Unfortunately, the sympathy for Massachusetts that the Intolerable Acts aroused amongst its neighbors meant that there were relatively few places in the colonies where royal officials were able to get a totally unbiased jury. Everybody knew at this point how unfair the treatment of Massachusetts had been and why this act was passed. And so that often meant that many retrials were sent over to England itself across the sea. And therefore, many of those trials would be dismissed because most of these plaintiffs, those pressing the lawsuit, couldn't afford to travel to England to continue pressing charges, and so the charges would have to be dropped. Leading to the idea that if a British official murdered somebody and simply went back to England, there would be nothing you could do about it. There is, however, one misconception surrounding the Justice Act today, And there's this belief that it somehow wrongly imprisoned colonists, and that wasn't really the idea. It basically did the near opposite. It didn't really put any colonists in jail. It just made it so that royal officials could almost never be put in jail for anything. Nonetheless, that was still viewed as a violation of some of the most fundamental rights of British citizens established in England's earliest legal texts, such as the right to swift justice, which was first chartered almost over 500 years prior in the Magna Carta signed by King John in 1215. So it's in the eyes of many colonists, this is an act that is undoing 500 years of precedent, which is a really big deal. For those of you who remember back to part 1, a running theme of most parliamentary representation prior to the Coercive Acts has generally been that much of it was for far more reasonable reasons than our narrative tends to remember. Most of the acts were founded on just plain economics, and I will be the first to say that I really don't know what the Crown was thinking with this one. The Administration of Justice Act essentially denied the colonies the only means for them to civilly file grievances. Right? If colonies like Massachusetts had already been assaulting officials and burning buildings for about 9 years at this point, taking away the only legal avenue for lawsuits means that they really have no other choice than to continue doing that, to continue rioting, right? So that one, I think, well, it's a bit silly at the time. I think the Parliament probably knew that and were just simply sort of arbitrarily asserting that, the act of rioting is illegal anyway. So we're going to make even your attempts at sort of civilly dealing with this matter utterly impossible and give you, we're essentially Parliament was kind of intentionally trying to brand colonists as criminals because they now can no longer follow the law. So I wish I could say the trouble ended there, but there are actually 2 more acts that, while they are not officially part of the Intolerable Acts, they were kind of conflated with them because they were passed around the same time, and because colonists were equally as angry about them. The first of them I'm sure you've heard of, and that would be the infamous Quartering Act of 1774, which granted royal officials, not just in Massachusetts, but throughout all of the 13 colonies, the authority to commandeer privately owned property for housing additional British military forces that were being sent over to the colonies to kind of deal with this insurrection. I've noted the year here because this was actually an amendment to a pre-existing act, the Quartering Act of 1765, which had one key difference. The Quartering Act of 1765 allowed proprietors in the colonies the freedom to volunteer whichever property they preferred to lend to house soldiers. And it also provisioned for monetary compensation as a sort of incentive for complying with this law. Even with the promise of monetary reward, the Quartering Act was understandably not very popular amongst property owners. So it sort of meant that when nobody volunteered property, Parliament amended the act to allow royal officials to sort of commandeer property instead of waiting around for people to make suggestions of where to house troops. And there's also a bit of a myth surrounding the Quartering Act, both back then and today, for the common belief that troops would be forced into colonial households, like this painting from the time period depicts. However, the housing of British troops in occupied civilian residences, as in your everyday homes, was actually outlawed many decades prior in 1692 with the Mutiny Act. And that was just one of a series of mutiny acts that were required to be re-ratified by the British Parliament every year until 1879. So it was definitely still in effect in 1774 when the Quartering Acts were passed. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? But believe it or not, the Mutiny Acts were actually, and the first Quartering Acts were actually in place to prevent a martial takeover, right? Not establish one. If you know anything about the English Civil War, which is a bit of a rabbit hole we don't have time to go into fully, but you might know that the British Empire actually had a really big problem with rule by martial law, especially among Puritans. It was Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans who took over the British government in a martial takeover in the 1680s. So it should suffice to say that Parliament essentially feared that British troops sustained in a civilian household would then lead the military to become independently sustained, independent from the government. If civilians were able to house troops in their homes and supply them, where would those troops' loyalties lie? Right, with the people, not with the government. So it was treated as a very serious possibility by British Parliament, and that's why they were required to re-ratify the Mutiny Act every single year. Governors in the colonies would have been in no way permitted to requisition civilian homes, especially if they were occupied. Only unoccupied spaces like a warehouse, a barn, maybe an inn, because that's a public space. However, because so few proprietors were willing to have their inns, their meeting halls, etc., used to house British troops, that meant that many governors did end up requisitioning private homes, and they would cite the Quartering Act as the reason, misconstruing it as a parliamentary mandate, saying it's not my decision, it's Parliament, in order to shirk the blame from the governor onto the Parliament overseas. In reality, if Parliament actually knew that's what the governors were doing, it would have been an act of treason, and those governors would have been hanged. It would have been seen as an act of mutiny. So the Intolerable Acts actually forbade the housing of British troops in civilian homes. Governors did it anyway because nobody really wanted to comply with the law. But nonetheless, the Quartering Acts were still viewed as a violation of the 1689 English Bill of Rights for other reasons, mostly because the maintenance of a standing army at all during peacetime was already constitutionally illegal. So if it's not unconstitutional on the basis of, if it's not truly unconstitutional on the basis of violating private property laws, it is violating laws about having a standing army. So it became rather clear that the Quartering Act was an antagonization against all of the 13 colonies, because Parliament certainly knew that that was illegal. It was them making a pretty overt statement of trying to house an army in the colonies for the actions of just Massachusetts. Yes. And finally, our next act, our last act we come to is the Quebec Act, which essentially expanded the conquered province of Quebec to include territories west of the Proclamation Line of 1763. So those of you who were here in part one will remember that colonists were essentially forbidden from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains after the French and Indian War. That territory was meant to be an Indian reservation, a Native American reservation. And however, in 1774, so 11 years later, all of that territory west of the Appalachian Mountains was opened up and considered part of Quebec, which would be allowed to be settled by British citizens from Quebec province, not from the 13 colonies. So it also guaranteed the protection of Catholicism throughout the province of Quebec, which had just doubled in size. And it legalized the reinstatement of Catholic practices like church ties. Despite being the only act from this time that made no internal legislations on the 13 colonies, the Quebec Act managed to be regarded as an affront to the most fundamental ideas of the 13 colonies and colonial freedoms that the British Empire was clearly no longer protecting, right? Things like the protection of Protestantism, which was the entire reason New England was settled. The pursuit of economic prosperity and expansion, which is a large reason why most of the southern colonies were settled. These issues had previously been rather separate, and had just found a target to converge upon with the Quebec Act. So this was a significant step on the path to unity between different colonial regions that had pretty distinct cultural values, which is something I think a lot of people today in America often forget, right? Not only were many of the colonies very culturally different from one another, they were also noticeably different from their modern counterparts as states today. You can see these differences at the largest scale between the northern and the southern colonies. So we'll start with the north. We, of course, all know the story of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock to pursue their Puritan faith, and indeed several other northern colonies, like Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, were also originally settled with motives of religious freedom, being sort of fundamental to their charter. The Puritan population of Massachusetts in particular originally left England because they felt it was still too Catholic after 200 years of Protestantism, which is the very reason the English Civil War happened, and it's a sentiment that they probably thought was true now that the British Parliament was seemingly rewarding Quebecois Catholics while simultaneously punishing Massachusetts. And let's not forget that the dominant industries in several northern colonies were things like logging, the fur trade, shipbuilding, brewing, and many other trades that in a modern sense we would probably regard as blue collar. Right? That's not a notion that existed during the colonial era, but it is a notion we have now. So there's a bit of a disconnect when we think about it today, but if I asked you to envision a place populated by heavily religious blue-collar tradespeople who were engaged in aggravated protest of a tyrannical government, you probably wouldn't picture New England. You'd probably picture a really culturally conservative place, right? And that's exactly right. Colonial New England was very much seen as a frontier territory. And it was seen as a much more rustic culture than both its modern counterpart in New England today and its southern colonial neighbors. Which brings us to places like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, all of which were chartered as proprietary colonies. And so those of you who remember back to part one, proprietary colony is essentially a province owned by a corporation. We talked about that a little bit. And in that regard, the southern colonies were essentially settled by venture capitalists, right? Indeed, the pursuit of prosperity in particular was fundamental to the southern colonies. And so when Parliament forbade the 13 colonies from expanding into the French and Indian War conquests, only to then give that territory to Quebec, many colonists, especially southern entrepreneurs, felt robbed of their earnings. Last time in part one, I drew an example to George Washington. He was actually promised over 200 acres of land in Ohio when he and his men fought in the French and Indian War. That's west of the Appalachian Mountains, and when the war concluded, he was not allowed to settle there. All of that land was then given to Quebecois people for them to freely settle. So, understandably, people felt a little bit robbed. And of course, the majority of these entrepreneurs that we're talking about here would have been proprietors of large-scale commercial farming operations driven by enslaved labor, right, plantations. That is not to say that the North did not have enslaved people, or that the South did not have normal non-plantation farms. Each had plenty of both, but it's just that the sheer scale of cash crop plantations that could be achieved by the warm southern climate meant that the exploitation of enslaved labor had a much more dramatic impact on shaping the culture of places like Virginia and the Carolinas than it did here in the North, where enslavement was in a sort of different capacity, a more domestic capacity. Ironically, this sort of led to the perception in the colonial period that the South had a greater quote-unquote refined culture, right? And that is simply due to the fact that economic and intellectual sort of pursuits had much more time to be followed because all of the manual labor was being done by people against their will, right? So I meant that the South sort of was in an ironic place culturally, that they could have, renowned philosophical institutions because most people weren't, most wealthy people that had the means to publish literature or discuss matters of politics weren't also sort of dually working on farms. They had enslaved labor for that. Nonetheless, this more sort of refined Southern culture, quote unquote, did allow for some good in the form of developments like the 1768 petition to His Majesty, Memorial to the House of Lords, and Remonstrance to the House of Commons, which was a collection of 3 documents sent to Parliament by delegates from the Virginia House of Burgesses as one of the first formally written protests of the American Revolution. And it is actually the earliest textual documentation of the moniker "no taxation without representation." Of course, we know by the time from last time that violent protests had already broken out in the northern colonies since at least 1764 over anti-smuggling regulations like the Sugar Act. So it sort of happened that no taxation without representation got adopted throughout the colonies because it sounded a lot better than it was a much better banner to rally protests under than saying, I don't want you to take our cannons away. It was something that sounded a little bit more refined, that all of the colonies attempted to, sort of pull some of that quote unquote perceived Southern refinement from the Virginia House of Burgesses. So I actually first heard of these documents from a professor I had in college, who was, I always love to see him go off on a tangent whenever we talk about the Revolution, because he was a Southerner, and he said that in the South, this part of the American Revolution is taught quite differently. He would always say something to the effect of, like, I understand why, Boston, you take all the credit. The revolution basically started here, but you guys did not coin no taxation without representation. That was a Southern contribution, and was essentially the idea that the entire revolution rallied behind. Northerners just kind of started chanting to make their protests seem a little bit more civilized. And while he was just poking a bit of fun, teasing New Englanders, I've never really forgotten it because it raised a really interesting point in that much of what we kind of accept today as a sort of complete story is really more like a collection of individual stories, right? Many of us already understand these ideas in theory, but we may not actually see this practice in reality until we hear them from a different narrator. So we're so familiar with the idea of New England being a place that's very progressive and with a very high standard of living, that the temptation to sort of retroactively apply that idea to our history, right? If we're progressive today, that must have come from somewhere, right? So there's a temptation to just sort of assume that people in this area have kind of always thought the way that we do today. But in reality, the colonists in the North would have been perceived by others elsewhere as much more rustic, whereas the South would have been perceived in its day as more cosmopolitan. Even so, the petition, memorial, and remonstrance was actually ignored by Parliament. So even though it might be a little more rustic and barbaric to go dumping tea in the harbor, at least that actually got Parliament's attention. It wasn't good attention, but it just goes to show that there's really no right or wrong answers here, right? It's just kind of different perspectives depending on who you ask or what time period we're talking about. Thankfully, the colonies would eventually get on the same page at the First Continental Congress in 1774, where delegates from the 12 of the 13 colonies held meetings in Philadelphia from the 5th of September to the 26th of October in order to organize a response to the Intolerable Acts, and they eventually resolved to a total boycott of all British imports until the Intolerable Acts were to be repealed. If you're wondering, the only colony that did not attend the delegation was Georgia, and that's because Georgia was the youngest of the 13 colonies. They had only been established for about 50 years at that point and did not consider themselves to have the sort of economic foundations to survive independent Britain. And so being named for King George did not feel comfortable attending the First Continental Congress. But the plans were eventually made to invite Georgia, as well as other British colonies in North America, like Quebec and Florida, to attend the Second Continental Congress the following year. And that was to take place if the Intolerable Acts were not repealed within a year. Ultimately, while the boycott succeeded to reduce British imports by nearly 97% in the coming months, the colonies would never get to know if their effort would have been sufficient to change Parliament's mind, because their decision was pretty much made for them by what is remembered as the shot heard around the world on April 19th in 1775 at the infamous battles of Lexington and Concord. So if you recall back to a couple of slides ago, the Massachusetts Government Act, Massachusetts had responded by creating a provincial congress of its own, which was independent from Britain, and therefore decided that it needed to bolster its militia forces. So under this new Massachusetts government, there were a wealth of weapons being stockpiled in a variety of places. Woburn was one. Concord is the most well known, but there was also an armory out in Springfield. So in response to this, a detachment of British regulars were sent from Boston to go and seize these munitions and these weapons. This had been successful at least once prior to Lexington and Concord. The armory in Boston had been successfully seized by the British, and movements were made against the armory in Woburn. So by the time British soldiers were marching on Concord, the colonies were a little bit more prepared, and they moved everything. So the British forces made it a little more than halfway to Concord when they encountered about 80 militiamen assembled on Lexington Common under the command of Captain John Parker. And he had specifically ordered his men not to engage the British regulars. His orders were simply to gather there on parade and to make their presence known without blocking the road to Concord. Nonetheless, a smaller force from the main British force sort of departed from the convoy and met those troops on Lexington Green. And while we don't know exactly what happened, there are many theories. It's kind of ironic that it became known as the shot heard around the world, because historians still hotly debate where this shot actually came from. We don't have enough time to unpack all of the theories, but the prevailing theory that I have found was that another smaller detachment of British regulars were searching the private residence of a man in Concord, who then fired at them from his house, which was then heard as a musket shot coming from the common, and then thus erupted into gunfire from both sides. So news of this hostility in Concord was enough to give militia forces from much further abroad time to prepare as the British continued their march. So by the time they reached Concord, around 400 militiamen remained at the ready, while the British regulars divided into smaller detachments even further to spread out and search for the contraband. So unfortunately for the regulars, the bulk of these militiamen assembled nearby the British force at their rear guard at North Bridge, which numbered just under 100 men who were left behind to kind of keep watch on their return route. back to Boston from Concord once the approximately 600 other troops completed their search, kind of moving in and out of homes and other buildings in Concord. But in a sort of reversal of the situation just hours before at Lexington, when a column of militia advanced towards the British rearguard, who had retreated across the bridge, somewhere a musket was discharged, and soon both sides were firing in earnest at each other until the regulars were routed completely and fled from the superior numbers of colonists to regroup with their main force. The militia forces took the opportunity to reposition to defensive ground around the route back to Boston and watch British troops sort of just march on by in retreat. This meant that about 600 more militiamen who were en route since the exchange at Lexington had trickled in from nearby towns and took up their positions. By the time the British made it back to Lexington, that 600 had accumulated an additional 1,000. So we're looking at 1,600 militiamen coming in from all the surrounding towns, joining in on what I'm sure you can guess was an absolute battering of the regulars on their march back. And the route that the British regulars took is actually roughly what is today Route 2 on the way back. So that was a major hot thoroughfare back then, and it has remained one. So pretty much the entire length of Route 2, militiamen were coming out of the woodwork from everywhere just to take pot shots at British soldiers. And it's kind of absurd to think about how exponentially it grew from that initial force of maybe one militia company of 120 on Lexington to 1,600 at Concord. That soon became 15,000 men from all across New England. In the coming days after Lexington and Concord, 15,000 New England militiamen formed a perimeter around the entirety of Boston. They basically chased the British all the way back to port and blockaded the entire city. And that would kick off what has become known as the Siege of Boston. So this turnout, understandably, made quite a statement with the British. And our founding fathers knew that something would have to be done to prepare for a response from Britain, because they knew they weren't just going to let this one go. So the founding fathers convened at the Second Continental Congress, much ahead of schedule, again in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775. And this was to decide on how all of the colonies were to proceed. So despite the notably gung-ho sentiments among many colonists, the Continental Congress's decision was ultimately very measured. They did not call for war. Rather, they sought to resolve the conflict with the Olive Branch Petition and the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. These are just a pair of documents that listed all of the grievances that we've talked about thus far, leading up to Lexington and Concord, and tried to justify the events that happened that day. The Olive Branch petition in particular offered to cease any hostilities and any boycotts and restore total adherence to British law, as long as the intolerable acts in the Siege of Boston was to be taken back. So at this point, it's important to note that it was only Massachusetts that was technically considered in a state of rebellion. Right. The other colonies could have very well left Massachusetts to its fate alone. Right. But for their support of Massachusetts with these documents, Parliament rejected both petitions, and all of the colonies were then considered to be in a state of rebellion. And this was a decree by King George himself. He was allegedly furious upon hearing the news and didn't even read the documents. Or so the story says. But so his response was, this fury from King George was pretty much expected. The Olive Branch Petition and the Declaration of the Causes and necessity were sort of just a last-ditch effort to prevent a full-on conflict. But the Continental Congress was prepared for the British to not take this very well. So they did make provisions for a war in case it was to break out. And on June 14th in 1775, George Washington was officially declared Commander-in-Chief just 1 month later by the Continental Congress. And General Washington would have quite a war ahead of him. The early campaigns of 1775 and 1776 are really a waxing and waning series of triumphs and defeats. I wish we had time to kind of go into the details of every battle, but the highlights basically are that the Siege of Boston ended in the bloody battle of Bunker Hill, which, despite being a technical loss for the militia, so the militia were ultimately forced to retreat from Bunker Hill, it did succeed in pushing the British from a position of a territorial position on the land in Boston. They were sort of pushed back into the sea. And it also was a Pyrrhic victory for the British. So they suffered far more casualties in forcing the militia to retreat from Bunker Hill than they actually inflicted on the militia in return. But like we said, there were about 15,000 militiamen surrounding Boston, so that's not too unexpected. This would prove significant in to the American cause in later campaigns, because Bunker Hill was very important in sobering many British commanders into the sort of realities that this really was going to be a proper war, right? Colonists weren't just going to run at the first sign of British cannon fire. They were going to dig in and fight, and it forced the British to adopt more conservative tactics, because what they sort of did at Bunker Hill was just throw men at the colonists, hoping that they would run away. The Siege of Boston was eventually broken in March of 1776, which was achieved with the much-needed artillery support captured during another pivotal continental victory at Fort Ticonderoga the previous November. And that resulted in the liberation of Boston and the total evacuation of the British occupying force. The British would sort of reconvene the bulk of their forces in the mid-Atlantic, specifically in New York. And this resulted in the next big campaign series with the Battle of Long Island. So New York Harbor was a very safe position for the British. It was very easily defendable, and that was precisely why the colonists wanted to take it from them. The colonists had very limited naval resources, and so New York Harbor would have been a perfect place to keep what little colonial navy existed, if not for the loss of the battles of New York Harbor. So after many failed attempts to capture New York Harbor from the British, General Washington and his forces were famously forced to retreat across the Delaware River into New Jersey and Pennsylvania on Christmas Day of 1776. And that was immortalized in this painting by Emanuel Lutz. I'm sure we all have seen this image and heard that story before. And although the Continentals would come to win the coming battles when the British pursued them to Trenton and Princeton in New Jersey, the harshities of that campaign would leave General Washington struggling to keep his men enlisted. It really put a dent in the morale of these series of losses and very hard-won victories, which meant that many soldiers wanted to just return home to their families and quit fighting altogether. This would continue to become a worsening problem for the Continentals as the war progressed. In an appeal to the Continental Congress to approve of stricter service regulations for his army in 1776, George Washington wrote, "The evils arising from short or even any limited enlistments of the troops are greater and more extensively hurtful than any person can form any idea of. It takes 2 or 3 months to bring new men into any tolerable degree acquainted with their new duty, and even longer still to establish such a subordinate way of thinking as is necessary for a soldier. Before this is accomplished, the time approaches for their dismissal. You are beginning to make interest for the continuance of another limited period, so you are obliged to lax your discipline." So in essence, the realities of Washington's men coming and going from campaign on a volunteer basis meant that he never had enough time to properly drill them into a hardened fighting force that would be comparable to what the British had. Because whenever the campaigns would become testing enough for them to properly accustom his recruits into the ways of war and to be a significant enough battle that it would actually make a difference in the longer span of the war, the men wanted nothing to do with it. Right? You don't want to sit through the hardest fighting that the British Empire has to offer. And so Washington would be forced to soften the army's approach, which further is counterproductive to not only building a capable force, but also to winning the war. So to give you a sense of just how severe the desertion was during these early campaigns, we're actually lucky to have a really good example from Essex County, and that would be the diary of James Stephens, who was a carpenter born in Andover in 1749, which was then just Andover, he was born in North Andover, which was just Andover at that time, and he later went on to serve as a Minuteman in the first year of the American Revolution in 1775. And just 2 weeks after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Stephens wrote, "Wednesday the 10th, we got our breakfast and then went on to the parade, and in the morning Captain Thomas Poor came out and spoke very rash concerning our choosing a sergeant, and said that we had no right to, which displeased the soldiers very much. They went off and did no duty that day. About 11 o'clock we paraded, and Captain Poor came and said he was misunderstood, and the company settled with him by making some recantation." So a note for anyone who attended my lecture on the history of the Boston accent, Mr. Stephens is a pretty good example of phonetic spelling. he wrote exactly as he pronounced words, and from his diary we get actually a really good sense of how colonial English may have been spoken. But I won't digress on that. We can talk about it at the end if anyone's curious. But here we see that there was so little discipline among the Minutemen that Stephens' company not only tried to elect their own sergeant because they didn't like the sergeant who was in charge at the time, when the commanding captain tried to make assertions that they had no authority to do that, the men just left. They just walked off and left their post until the captain was willing to apologize. And from the very outset of the war, this idea, right, the American Revolution being founded on ideals of individual freedom, was thus in direct conflict with the entire mission of winning the war against Britain, right? Perhaps most unfortunately for General Washington, that was actually to some degree the very intention. So in arguing against a more professionalized Continental Army, Samuel Adams wrote in 1776, "In a standing army, soldiers are apt to consider themselves as a body distinct from the rest of the citizens. They have their arms always in their hands. Their rules and their discipline is severe. They soon become attached to their officers and disposed to yield implicit obedience to their commands. Such a power should be watched with a jealous eye." So from the perspective of many founding fathers, not just Samuel Adams, a standing army was an uncomfortable idea, right? They had lived under British occupation before, and they saw that a professional military sort of ran the risk of becoming independent from the society and taking over the colonies, just like had happened during the English Civil War. So it's to prevent the military from being a tool of abuse. Many founding fathers believed that the soldiers should have the choice to leave. And Well, it was certainly a possibility that a professional army could result in a martial takeover. The reasons that Adams cites for this risk, right? He says they always have their arms in their hands, so they're very familiar with weapons. They have their rules and their discipline is severe, so and they really respect their officers, right? Those are all qualities that actually make effective soldiers. He's arguing against those qualities because they're dangerous, right? But the argument of George Washington would be, yes, and these dangers should be directed towards the British, right? As long as we have proper discipline, a martial takeover of the colonies by our own men won't happen. It was Adams and many other colonial politicians who would still insist to rely on what became known as summertime soldiers and sunshine patriots. And that was sort of a name that was coined following the desertions of the early campaigns. So this is partly because, desertion or not, the victories that the militia forces were able to achieve in Massachusetts specifically were actually very impressive. Even though the men were constantly walking off from the war, and even though there was a big lack of discipline and knowledge of combat, they did still break the siege of Boston. So that was, it's a really big talking point, in saying, well, look, it clearly worked. So we should keep doing it that way. That's the practical reason. The sort of philosophical reason was because to the Founding Fathers, an army of passionate volunteers was considered to be better ideologically aligned with the ideas of the American Revolution than hiring soldiers was, right? So, basically the idea that if a soldier is working for pay, what happens if we run out of money? Will he continue fighting, or will he go home? So you would deal with the sort of perceptions that you would deal with desertion in either case. So the idea of the Patriot, because it was economically cheaper, was romanticized to a very high degree. Remember that the British government was the only source of economic prosperity for the colonies up until this point, and now they were no longer trading with one another. So the Continental Army was an expense that was perceived as sort of a little bit hard to fathom for the Founding Fathers, and so there's a sort of philosophical reason, a practical military reason, and also a fiscal reason as why they definitely preferred patriots. However, once voluntary service began to significantly impede wartime progress, rather than embracing an alternative professional army, many colonists actually began to sort of further romanticize the ideal of the citizen soldier in an effort to encourage more free voluntary service, to the degree that many full-time professional Continental soldiers were often denied a lot of public recognition. And that did not help Washington's re-enlistment numbers, because it is a narrative that existed then and still kind of persists into our memory today with our glorification of the Minutemen, right? A lot of towns have statues to famous Minutemen, but yet seldom or ever, at least much lesser recognition of Continental soldiers. Fortunately for General Washington, the Continental Congress would eventually make the concession and allow for full-time enlistees to be paid for their service, bound by term contracts, and most importantly, punished for deserting. It should be noted that very many Continental soldiers never actually received the payment they were promised, because, as we said, the whole reason, one of the big reasons that the Founding Fathers preferred patriots was because they didn't have a lot of money to pay professional soldiers. So you might be able to see how patriotic ideals are a very powerful means to beginning a war, but may not necessarily be the most effective means to ending a war, right? But the Founding Fathers were in a tight spot, and there were some very practical reasons for preferring volunteers. Okay, so the very reason that General Washington so badly needed professional soldiers in the first place was because of the highly professionalized nature of colonial warfare, especially in the case of the British Empire, who was, inarguably the most professional army in the world at the time. And it's sort of ironic today because you often hear the opposite narrative, right? People today usually mock the idea of linear warfare formations, as are depicted here to the right. So this idea did not come from our founding fathers. This is absolutely kind of a modern notion, the idea that the practice of line warfare is kind of silly, would not have been the notion held by soldiers during the colonial period. They took it quite seriously because it was the way that the British conducted war, right? And it had been very effective for them in conquering much of the known world at that time. So linear warfare was the dominant form of fighting for a very good reason. Firstly, that is because infantry filed and ranked shoulder to shoulder, like you see here, or what was called close order formation, serves many different purposes at once. You have to remember that firearms in this period are still developing technology and could produce really quite varying accuracy, even from a very skilled, very practiced shooter, right? So, and of course very slow to reload. So, assembling your troops in close order formations like this allows the soldiers to fire their muskets in volleys, right, all at once. Where the first rank would all fire at once, and then they would get out of the way for the next rank to come forward and all fire at once. And this gives the folks that then move to the back time to reload, and there's never a gap in fire. It keeps fire constantly going. Furthermore, these densely packed infantrymen would be armed with bayonets. And that was by far the most effective counter to charges by cavalry. Cavalry was the most pivotal development in warfare since ancient times. Wherever there are horsemen, there is always a challenge, and so this was no different during the colonial period. The development of sophisticated infantry formations would critically provide an easily maneuverable force of footmen that could they could move around quickly, they were quite mobile, and with their bayonets all packed together, they would give horsemen a hard time breaking through their lines. And that was sort of the idea with that. Finally, infantry were, and perhaps probably still are, the most effective tool for holding ground, right? And this was especially important to the nature of the war that the British were fighting, right? Despite being the aggressors from the colonial standpoint, from the political point of view, from the tactical point of view, the British were essentially on the defense, right? Even though the colonies would say that the British initiated the war, the British occupied all of the key colonial ports. So theoretically, all they had to do to win this war was just not lose those cities. They just had to defend them. So it's a situation of the aggressor being technically on the defense tactically. And when you're trying to defend territory or even trying to capture territory, the implication is that you would like that territory to remain intact so that it can continue to be a valuable resource. If fighting was to take place in the cities that the British occupied, with the nature of warfare, cannon fire and other things, it was very likely that those cities would be destroyed. So much of the fighting would take place in fields outside of the cities, right? So to not actually risk the asset that you're defending, the British are not going to hold up in Boston, they're going to hold up in the fields around Boston. And for that reason, linear warfare makes a lot of sense. So you often hear fun poked at the uniforms as well, right? But given the system of warfare that we've just described, the uniforms also make a lot of sense. So remember that the days of armor, right, are well past us thanks to gunfire. So if you have to outfit your troops with something, they might as well be given a uniform that would make it easy to identify your troops from your opponent's troops, and your officers from your enlisted men. So you have to remember the battlefield would have been a haze of smoke during this time, and communication would have been pretty much limited to what an individual soldier could see or hear, which would probably be not very much. Right, there would be smoke from musket fire, just covering the entire field. Most soldiers from this time period probably would have already been half deaf from all the cannon fire and gunfire going off sort of right by their heads constantly. And so these colorful uniforms really serve to, they're more of a way of communication than they are than anything else. And most practically, the British uniforms were red not to present a sort of fancy masculine target. They were red because the British had the largest army in the world, and red dye was the cheapest color of dye. So if you have to color your uniform something, you might as well make the budget-friendly choice, which of course it always comes back to economics in this time period. So here I have some images of 18th century uniforms, British uniforms that are preserved in the United Kingdom's National Armoury Museum. And so in the context that we've just learned, you can sort of see these concepts kind of in play. So on the left here, you have an enlisted soldier's coat. So this particular one didn't actually belong to an infantry regular. It actually would have been worn by a member of the foot guard. And those were specialized troops who were deployed for tasks like guarding important people or maybe guarding important convoys. But the coats worn by your average field soldier aren't actually preserved very well, right? So we don't really have very many good lasting examples of a standard issue British regular coat because those things got destroyed. They were worn until they couldn't be worn anymore, and they don't really find their way into museums. It's a little bit fancier of a infantry coat that maybe didn't see as much use and was worth a bit more money and would be a nice souvenir to take home and maybe get passed down from generation to generation. So that's why we have the coat of the foot guard, but the Royal Armouries don't have a great example of like a standard issue infantry coat. But the main idea is that this coat is still worn by a private, right? This is not the coat of an officer. And by contrast, you can see the coat of an officer here, which has fancy golden buttons, and it has this gorget, and it has these tassels on the shoulders, and all of those features serve to distinguish an officer from an enlisted man, is basically the idea. The green lapels on this one stand out only because this coat belonged to a different regiment altogether, and that was the 49th Regiment of Foot. So the green on his lapels, if these two men were in the same regiment, would have also matched. That's also a useful feature that allows soldiers from the same army not to get mixed up in other units that they don't belong to. Right, so each unit would have its sort of own color of lapel, and all of this serves very practical purposes. It's not necessarily just to make the soldiers look fancy, although maybe in the case of the officers, they want to look a little bit fancy. And then finally here on the right, we have an example of a drummer's coat, which is very ornate compared to the other two. And that's very important because the drummer serves as the officer's direct line of communication to the enlisted men, right? So you can, like I said, visibility would have been very difficult. Certainly most soldiers would have been hard of hearing. So drummers were extremely important as really the only way that officers could communicate with their troops on the battlefield. And that's the reason this drummer looks, this drummer's coat looks like this, so that any soldier, no matter who they are, can pick out that that's the drummer. There will be no confusion. And so they know to only follow the specific orders issued by the drummer, which would have been issued via, pre-memorized series of, drumming patterns that all the troops would have been drilled to know. And things like that are the reasons that George Washington needed professional soldiers. It's this style of warfare takes a lot of memorization. You don't get words directly from your officer's mouth all the time. In fact, most of the time you'd be trying to sort of decode the orders coming from a drummer. And if you've ever tried playing a game of telephone, you know why that's important, right? They need to come from one source. It would be even harder to fight if orders were passed from the officer to an enlisted man and then to every other enlisted man by word of mouth. The unit would probably get very confused. So, I'm also very fortunate to have been lent some great images of these kind of tactics in action by a friend in the living history community, Chris Wolfe, who is the creator and former commander of the Light Infantry Company of the 4th, a colonial British Army reenactment group. And here you can see just how obstructing even a little bit of smoke would be from a distance. So you have redcoats here, and then you have colonials up on the hill, and even that little bit of smoke does a lot to kind of obscure everything and blend the troops in with the grass and all that other stuff. And all right, here you can see the effectiveness of bayonet formations against cavalry. So the 4th Infantry Company doesn't operate on quite the scale that the British Army did, but this is a demonstration of how just 3 infantrymen with bayonets are able to hold off horsemen, right? So that's an important reason for these sort of close order formations. And where there was an even greater risk of encountering cavalry, even larger formations would be able to do this at an exponential scale. At this point, I'm sure we're all wondering, what about guerrilla warfare that we've always heard so much about? And that absolutely did also take place. So they didn't call it guerrilla warfare at the time. They would have called it skirmishing or light infantry skirmishing. And it was indeed a major part of the fighting as well. But you might be surprised to learn that it was actually originally used and introduced by the British, not by the colonists. So, in fact, the British Army had been very familiar. The British Army had been made very familiar with skirmish tactics for a long time by the days of the Revolution, and they employed them to great effect during their victories in the French and Indian War. These infantry tactics, skirmishing, were actually famously developed by Rogers Rangers, which are depicted here on the right. And you might know that the Rogers Rangers were originally a militia group formed by Robert Rogers of Methuen, which in the time of colonial settlement was part of Haverhill. By the Revolution, it was its own town. But today, Methuen's mascot, the Rangers, is still a nod to Rogers Rangers. So Rogers and his Rangers fought for the British Army during the French and Indian War, and they found such success on their campaigns that the British Army formally adopted Rogers' tactics codified in the 28 Rules of Ranging, which is characterized by things like the use of forests and spreading out. And he also was made famous for using snowshoes, which was a tactic that Rogers adopted from Native American allies in the French and Indian War. And believe it or not, the 28 Rules of Ranging is actually still considered recommended reading for U.S. Army Rangers today, who they kind of honorarily trace their origin to Rogers Rangers in the British Army. And if you think that Roger's way of fighting sounds like a more reasonable way to wage war, the British would agree with you. And most of the armies of that day would agree with you. Light infantry skirmishing was generally the default tactic whenever line warfare couldn't be employed. So if you weren't in the field trying to defend a city, then you would certainly seek cover and hide in the woods and all of that. Because in the woods, in the forest, there isn't really a danger of encountering cavalry in a big formation. That was really the big threat was cavalry. But the trees prevent, the trees and the rough ground kind of prevent a cavalry charge. So yes, if you were in the forest, you would certainly take cover. And when not skirmishing, light infantry skirmishers didn't just wait around. They actually had a great use in flanking the movements of heavier infantry formations. As they were more maneuverable and could more easily intercept enemy forces attempting to counter-maneuver. And that there's another narrative that we hold on today about guerrilla warfare, and that it was kind of the main deciding factor in the fate of the War for Independence, not just kind of one part of it. We often hear that it was the colonists' willingness to utilize guerrilla warfare and the British's unwillingness to utilize it that somehow led to this sort of massive toppling of the British Empire. But that's really not the case. I mean, it was the British who adopted skirmishing first, and this narrative comes from the idea of guerrilla warfare aligns better with the idea of citizen soldiers taking up arms and hiding in the woods to fight a bigger foe better than it serves to sort of further glorify that ideal of a patriot and the founding fathers and how they wanted volunteer soldiers. It's an appealing idea, but the reality is both sides would have been using whatever tactics gave them an advantage. And here you can see that when the situation allowed, British soldiers would, of course, make use of cover. Much like you hear, it was only the colonists doing this, wasn't the case. And they would also make use of terrain features like tree lines to allow groups to operate in smaller teams and more open formations, which are more appropriate for things like ambushes or precision strikes, or because, like I said, the terrain reduces the risk of cavalry being able to get through the trees and run you down. So if guerrilla warfare isn't the deciding factor, then we have to answer the question of what was. And the answer to that question is overwhelmingly the French, who saw the American cause as an opportunity to counter the British Empire's power in North America. See, France had withdrawn from North America after the French and Indian War. That's why Quebec was under possession of the British Empire. And so France was eager to kind of get involved in the American Revolution because it was a chance to potentially weaken the British Empire, who was their biggest rival. So thanks to negotiations from our French ambassador, Benjamin Franklin, France began smuggling arms and ammunition and other supplies to the colonies to aid in George Washington's earliest campaigns, as early as 1776. By 1777, 90% of the muskets used by American soldiers were actually made by the French. And for a while, it was really supplies was all the French were able to do because the French government was hesitant about deploying soldiers and actually risking another war with the British Empire, right? A war being fought between the colonies and Britain could quickly erupt into a war being fought by France and Britain and the colonies, and could also potentially extend to Europe, right? Because if France and England go to war, that's not just war on American soil, that is also war back home for them. So the French decided that the best thing that they could do was issue supplies, but that's not to say it was all just business. So public opinion in France actually was quite favorable to the American cause. And that was significant enough for some French citizens to seek direct involvement, independent of the French government's decision. So they would have been considered privateers. They were French soldiers, mercenaries, operating not under the French, not on French authority, but still sort of helping with everything tactically and offering much needed insight into how to fight the British because they were very experienced at it. The most famous of these Frenchmen is undoubtedly General Marquis de Lafayette. He is pictured here bundled up to his nose alongside George Washington at the Battle of Valley Forge. And that's after just hearing about the American cause had inspired him to pay his own way to the colonies in 1777, and to whom there is a statue dedicated here in Haverhill in Lafayette Square. If you've seen the statue of Lafayette, he's on a horse over in Lafayette Square. Lafayette Square is named after him. And I believe that statue was put up originally by French-Canadian mill workers who had settled in Haverhill. There are a lot of monuments in the United States today sort of honoring this early relationship between France and the colonies, the most significant of which is the Statue of Liberty, right? That was a gift from France, sort of honoring this long-time friendship that was formed during the American Revolution. And yes, so French public opinion undoubtedly expressed sympathy for the American cause to the extent that after the American Revolution, we all know that the French Revolution happened, right, just under 10 years later. There was sort of such a interrelationship that many officers who had fought for the colonies had gone back to France and were the same officers that were some of the same officers that were instrumental in the French Revolution. It wouldn't be much longer until before all of France followed Lafayette's lead with the 1778 Treaty of Alliance, which officially recognized the United States of America's independence as an allied nation. And that was significant because it was the first time the colonies were recognized internationally, as the United States of America, and that was first recognized by the French. And of course, that led the British Empire to declare war on France for their official involvement. They were now publicly involved in the American Revolution. France would continue to supply the colonies with desperately needed naval support. Now that they were sort of officially at war with Britain and there was no more beating around the bush, the entirety of the French Navy could be sort of levied to the cause because that was what the colonies needed the most. And if you remember what we discussed just a while ago about the British defensive strategy taking defensive positions in key port cities, the French coming in from Europe were able to blockade on the other side of the British, right, and bombard from the sea and sort of trap the British between a French blockade and a port that is being surrounded by Continentals on the other side, and sort of force them into a scissor maneuver essentially. And it was and these efforts would significantly reduce the British Empire's capacity to continue riding out the war from cozy positions in New York or Philadelphia, and it opened up the Atlantic as a second front, right? So while these efforts will forever be remembered as the greatest American triumph, sometimes I think we are want to forget that this was quite possibly not achievable on our own without the French. And our colonial predecessors did definitely understand this idea. Indeed, it was abundantly clear following General Cornwallis's defeat at the last major North American battle of the war at Yorktown in 1781, when his troops surrendered flanked by both American and French forces on either side of them in equal measure, which sort of went to show off how much of an ally the French and the colonies were in this war, and is further remembered by the French mediated Peace of Paris that finally negotiated an end to the war on September 3rd in 1783. So, at last, the United States of America achieved its independence, and we all know most of the story from there. Of course, the Declaration of Independence had already been in effect for years by 1776, or since 1776, excuse me, and it would be accompanied by the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and as well as the drafting of the U.S. Constitution in 1788. And that's generally where most revolutionary narratives would end the story. But in a final note, because I definitely need to, I definitely can't let you all go without at least one last note on 18th century economics. As great of an achievement as the winning of independence from the world's greatest superpower was, what you almost never hear being considered is that if you have separated from the greatest superpower that the colonial world has known, that means you're now in competition with the greatest superpower the colonial world has ever known. And so the young United States would not be off to an easy start, right? Thanks to the idea of mercantilism that we talked about a little bit before, the British Empire had been our primary trade partner since the foundation of the colonies. And since the United States is now suddenly a foreign nation, mercantilism means that the British will not trade with them, right? Mercantilism means that you only trade within your empire. So the British would sanction American trade just like they would French trade or Spanish trade. And because of mercantilism, all of America's trade connections had been with Britain. That means we now had no economy following the war. And it sent the U.S. into a severe economic depression for many years after the American Revolution. To sort of compound this, the colonies were, or I should say the U.S., was obliged to repay this sizely wartime debt owed to France for their aid, because as much as narratives of patriotism and alliance go, it always comes back to money, and the French weren't going to let us off the hook for the bill of their contribution to the war. And our founding fathers had really no means of collecting income from the colonies because taxation was not part of the Articles of Confederation, right? If taxation was the whole issue of why the colonies separated from England in the first place, nobody thought to put taxation as a right of the United States government to tax the states. And so the federal government had really no source of income and was in a lot of debt to France, and also in a pretty poor position when we're talking about international trade. So that is why the Articles of Confederation were ultimately revoked in favor of the United States Constitution, which just after the Bill of Rights gets right into matters of taxation, right? So once again, that's a good example of how patriotic ideals are factored into the American Revolution back then and on our remembrance of those events today, right? We rightfully so reflect on the highlights of the American achievement in the fight for independence, but it wouldn't be among the most pivotal events in Western history if it didn't come with just as many struggles mixed into it. So like I said, when I began this topic back in part 1, we don't really need to dismantle the truth of the story of the American Revolution in order to fill in the gaps between those truths. Because in giving proper acknowledgement to the obstacles that Parliament's legal justification for taxing the colonies and the genuine lethality of the British Army, rather than sort of downplaying those factors, that only makes the triumph against those odds that much more impressive, right? So if we acknowledge the fact that there was a lot of legal precedent for the British government to tax the colonies, and if we acknowledge that the British Army was like a really severe, overwhelming foe, that doesn't detract from the story of the American Revolution. I think it makes it a little bit more impressive. And so with that, I thank you once again for joining us for the conclusion to Written by the Victors, Remembering the American Revolution. And I have plenty of sources if you're interested in learning more about this. AmericaInClass.org is just really invaluable. They have a lot of primary sources from this time period, a lot of quotes from people like the Founding Fathers and opinions on different acts and all of those things. And I definitely recommend checking out Jeremy Black's 18th Century Warfare Reconsidered. It's a really interesting publication that if you like the kind of tactical side of this. Yes, there's just you can yes, and you can find the work of Chris Wolfe at the Recreated Light Infantry Company of the 4th, and also the work of my friend Brandon Fisicella with the 54th Regiment of Foot at brandon.org. Yeah, you said you know Brandon?
I watch his videos.
Yeah, he's really great. He was from Everett. I believe he lives in Ohio now, but he's really involved in the reenactment community. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to take them, or any comments. Yes?
Would you explain the Magna Carta, what it is?
Oh, sure, yes, certainly. The Magna Carta was a document that was signed during the Crusades in England. How many of us are familiar with the stories about Robin Hood and King John and King Richard? That's what those events are based on. So it was King John was essentially the think of him like an interim king while his older brother King Richard was off fighting in the Crusades, and King John was perceived as a very, very bad king by the people in Britain at that time. This was in the 1200s. So bad that it led to the formation of essentially the first parliament. The British Parliament, in its sort of earliest stages, drafted a constitution that they forced King John to sign, which guaranteed rights to British citizens that King John was not to be seen as protecting. So in that moment, in 1215, the significance of the Magna Carta, which just means Great Charter, in Latin, is the establishment essentially of the first sort of proto-parliamentary monarchy, right? The first constitutional monarchy. It's very significant in that it guaranteed. When we say the Magna Carta guaranteed the rights of English citizens, at that time citizenry had a much different concept than we have today. So citizens would have only been landowning folk in Britain at that time. So what it did was protect landowning folk from King John overstepping and seizing their land or seizing their private soldiers and things like that. But it was a very big step on the sort of path to constitutional monarchy.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, if you have any other questions, I thank you all for coming, and I hope you come to. Oh, yes.
Well, when they finally got what they wanted, they found out to their horror that the British Empire wasn't going to protect them anymore.
Exactly, that's right.
And all their shipping in the Mediterranean, which was a big moneymaker, was getting taken over by the North Africans, the Barbary pirates.
Yes, certainly. I mean, the American Revolution does overlap with the Golden Age of piracy, and a lot of we talked about this a bit in part 1. So for those of you who weren't here, a lot of the earliest acts that were passed in the colonies actually were to dissuade piracy. Things like smuggling and attacking ships at sea. That's really the sort of earliest legal relationship that the colonies had with the British Empire. So yeah, that came back in full force once that protection was removed, certainly.
Yeah, and then they actually had the goal to ask the British to give them protection from Barbary pirates, and the British told them to take a hike.
Yes, and if you know your early American history, that it wouldn't be very long before the British and the U.S. were at war again in the War of 1812, right? So definitely was an uneasy relationship going forward. I would say through much of the 1800s, certainly.
Lafayette got disillusioned. He was asked about his service in America, you know, much, much later. When he was old and he says, you know, if I had known they were gonna turn it into a slave state, I wouldn't have bothered.
I'm not familiar with that comment, but that's an interesting perspective. I haven't read that from Lafayette, but I'll have to look into it more.
Well, great job.
Thank you.
Wouldn't it have been cheaper just to complain a lot and pay all the taxes?
That is a great question, and I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah, squeaky wheel gets a grease.
We talked about this in part one, but the taxes that the British were levying from the colonies compared to the taxes they were levying from British citizens in England were so much less. Like, if we look at the total tax burden of the British Empire, 97% of their income was coming from Britain. It was only 3% of their income that was coming from the colonies, and the population of the colonies outnumbered Britain by like 5 times. So for every 300 for roughly every $300 paid in taxes by a British citizen, a colonist would have paid only $1. It was a really significant difference, and that was because initially the colonies were private enterprises, so they weren't under the government, right? It was just only when the government decided to try and kind of incorporate them officially as British territory that they said, well, I don't know about that. The standard of living in the colonies was also much higher. People generally had a lot more wealth just due to the economic prosperity, and you know, there's so much more land and more resources. So yeah, it's very interesting. I think that the loyalist sentiments of the day certainly were that we should just pay the taxes and they'll probably leave us alone. But yeah, there's also the idea that most of the taxes actually wouldn't have really affected the working class very much. Things like the Stamp Act put a tax on paper and things like attorney licenses and land grants, and those are things that the 99% of people are not having to deal with on a day-to-day. It was the wealthy elite that sort of had a problem with, you know, paying their 2 cents. Yes.
Well, then, great job.